Hey folks, we're back again with a new Roguelite review, specifically Angry Mob Games' Trinity Fusion, whose early access I'd covered in a first look. Since it's fully released, it feels like now's a good time to finish my foray and ask that burning question. Was this medley of multiversal mayhem mediocre, or an excellent example of 3 real estate? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Progress. It comes in many forms, and one has been the creation of the multiverse, splintered into facets, with each providing resources necessary to advance the prime reality, subservience by any other name. It was a delicate balance, in all truth, and all it took was discontent for it to fray apart. A rebellion in one dimension started, only to spread to the others like wildfire, drastically skewing the balance for those myriad realities and sending them on a downward spiral towards oblivion. The only hope left is to fold them back into a unified whole, and yet, to do so would require agents in each reality working in tandem, hence the Trinity system. It allows an individual who exists across the various realities to synchronize with their alternate selves, but only if they have a living alternate in each facet of reality. And given how apocalyptic things have gotten, only one person remains eligible. So yeah, that's the premise. Try not to think too hard on the statistics behind it and just enjoy the concept. And the fact that it's been fleshed out a fair bit since Trinity's time in early access. Admittedly, the way it's told hasn't changed. It still kicks off with an introductory cutscene and then a bit of scene setting as you play through each of the 3 dimensions as Maya's altars. That said, there's a bit more to see this time around. While initially you could wander around the game's hub area and talk to the various NPCs as each character to hear dialogue, it's been expanded to a substantial degree in order to support the story's progression. Overall, it's pretty nice and adds something to look forward to during your journey. Only, there are some weird little flaws you can encounter. Specifically, you can actually outpace the game's storytelling. See, if you get to a point where you can comfortably complete runs of the game, it's entirely plausible that you'll be able to see the game's climax well before all the hub cutscenes can play out, which can get a bit confusing admittedly, and then sort of funny when you start seeing those scenes retroactively. Still, it's a very clear improvement over its predecessor, and the dialogue does a great job at progressing the overarching story. Admittedly, the bestiary entries are still more model unlocks than additional lore, but that's fine, given that there's a number of hidden info shrines scattered throughout the levels, which help to flesh out the world's history, the various factions, and to fill in certain blanks.
The engineers came up with a plan. They could not stop the chain reaction, but they could keep its effects contained by forcibly merging the 4 universes back together.
Though I'd only managed to acquire a bit less than half by the time I'd reached and beaten the last boss a handful of times. Admittedly, I did feel motivated to do just that, if only because there was some post-victory dialogue I still got to encounter at the hub. Speaking of which, now's about as good a time as any to focus on how this game plays, and well, it's an action roguelite of the hack and slash variety. Really, if you've played Dead Cells, it's apt to feel a bit familiar as you shimmy through a randomly generated world, making a loadout with whatever you can scrounge. Though, by that same measure, you'll be apt to notice some immediate differences. For one thing, its level design is considerably more linear by default, consisting of 3 different worlds you'll be running through, each composed of several stages and a pair of bosses. Notably, the route you'll be taking by default is entirely dictated by what character you pick, and it's only by entering a certain bonus stage that you can switch onto a different route. And even then, it doesn't wind up feeling all that varied, given that it simply switches which track you're on, but doesn't actually change up the stages themselves. Which is pretty noticeable given the randomization for each level layout is decidedly minimal, resulting in a number of ventures feeling acutely similar to each other. Even the bonus stages, which are essentially mini roguelike dungeons, are fairly lacking when it comes to diversity, to the point that you'll rapidly find yourself encountering the same set piece even within a pair of playthroughs. Which means, largely, the appeal falls on the mechanics themselves, and this is where Trinity Fusion starts to show its strength. The overall pace of its combat is fairly quick, eschewing the stamina management of many of its peers in favor of aggressive finesse, of figuring out where an enemy's openings are, or how to create them through a well-timed dodge or air dash, which feels necessary given your initial frailty. And the weapon only compounds this, as each of them have their own movesets, which can vary from extended ground combos to aerial options, or even charge attacks for the heavier weapons. While they aren't overly complex, they still feel distinct enough that you'll likely find yourself gravitating towards certain types. Really, your only limitation comes in the cooldowns associated with your abilities, which are blessedly short, and the energy pool associated with your sub-weapons. And, given that energy replenishes by smacking enemies, it only further reinforces the emphasis on swift doses of violence. Well, that, and the fact that each of the game's tritagonists have their own distinct arsenal pools, which goes a long way towards influencing how they fight. I'm quite partial to Kara, really, given those chonky charge weapons I mentioned. All hers, and she has some pretty funny special abilities too, both in regards to her cooldown abilities, but also the character's traversal abilities, because, well, yeah, each one does have traversal abilities which help to broaden the way they can move about the world, which can also factor neatly into their combat abilities, such as violently grappling onto an aerial target. Or, you know, they would function in this manner if I hadn't encountered a weird bug which had me forgetting those abilities as those characters after I acquired them. I don't even know what happened other than it affected all three of the protagonists and severely impacted them. Especially Kara, who lacks the double jump and wall jump options the other two have. Natively, anyways, given there's the fusion system. So, during the stages, you'll occasionally encounter quaint little shrines, which let you spend currency to fuse one of your alternate selves. While this lets you use one of the character's weapons in a third weapon slot, the real game changer is it also lets you acquire the movement abilities associated with the other characters, which is an absolute game changer for Kara, especially since her unique ability was disabled for some godforsaken reason. I've beaten the game several times, there's no reason it should switch off, it just... Still, I will say that the game itself feels better to play. First off, while the basic system of beating up enemies to level and thus increasing the level of weapons you encounter is intact, the actual attributes of the weapon feel nicer to play around than its early access variant, since there's now a hub upgrade that lets you level up your weapons to your current power level, allowing you to maximize your build for boss fights, even if you decided to hold on to an earlier weapon just because it had neat affixes. The in-run character perks have also been changed up a fair bit, since they've thrown out the rarity system in favor of a solid array of traits to choose from, which have the added benefit of providing set bonuses if you snag 3 of a kind. It's nice, really, and while it could have used a bit more variety on that front, since I wound up seeing a lot of the same perks every run, it still allowed for a certain degree of theory crafting. I'll also admit that I had a bit more leeway to mess around than I did earlier for a number of reasons. First off, I still had all of my saved up meta resources and hub upgrades from when I did the first look video of this, so I'd already bought a lot of character perks like extra health, crit, and regaining health after being damaged. These helped a lot for helping me to pull in consistent wins. The addition to a second set of perks that also influenced the stages was nice too, such as the aforementioned weapon upgrade machine or improving the perk distribution on high-level weapons. That said, another key element was just the fact that the bosses and basic enemies felt a bit more finely tailored. Yes, they still hit like a train if you're using the glass cannon perk, but they no longer felt like they had glutted health pools, and they weren't overly relentless with their attack patterns. Unless you switch the difficulty modifier to hardcore, because not only does everything hit hard, they also continue to get stronger the longer you take to clear a stage, making the overall experience a brutal race against the clock. So really, you deserve it. That said, you can freely swap difficulties at any point, so really, that is on you. But hey, if you are craving a challenge, there is also an optional boss rush and endless mode you can unlock once you've done everything, which provides a bit more content to fiddle with. It just didn't click with me, but it is what it is. But what about the presentation? On the whole, it remains fine. The stages look nice, the enemies and boss designs are neat, and I'll admit I found some of their phase transition animations to be cool, and their attacks are generally well telegraphed. They also made the protagonist's attack animations feel smoother too. Audio-wise, my opinion also hasn't really changed. The music and sound design is solid enough and should carry you through the game. Which means it's time for the conclusion, and I have technically been poking at this game for a long while now, including a few sessions where I just dove back in to double check the notes I'd made, and to make sure I knew what I was talking about. And yeah, on the whole, I think it has progressed since early access. The game is substantially less janky than it once was. I mean, yes, I could still out of bounds myself when I had a character's full kit, because having both double jumps and wall jumps is an extremely powerful combination, but that required some pretty deliberate attempts to poke my nose into the far corners of the map in search of Easter eggs, as opposed to, say, taking a ladder and it just dropping me off in the abyss like it did during early access. Admittedly, the map generation does still feel limited, which isn't the greatest feeling in the world given that the game is iterative. And I cannot fathom playing the game anywhere near long enough to unlock all of the meta progression upgrades, because mother of God, some of them are prohibitively expensive, costing hundreds of resources, and anything that costs yellow resources just sucks, since you tend to acquire them one at a time, and it's not uncommon if you only find between 10 to 15 in a given fully completed run where you beat the last boss. Maybe if there'd been a tantalizing post-game, I could have seen myself fiddling with it, but well, no. It's more of the same, and while it's certainly been palatable for a time, I did hit a general sense of fatigue. I just wish that Trinity Fusion had a bit more variety. For a game that asks you to replay it so many times, it gets wearying in a certain way. Ultimately, while the game is in a better place, there are certainly times where it felt like a slog. Really, by the tail end of things, I was sticking with it more to see the resolution than the experience itself, which is why I ultimately rate this one as a fumble. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment, and if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell. For Discord savvy folks, there's a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, in the description, and to my Patreon if you're curious to see reviews before they hit YouTube, or just to support me, like my patrons Green Witch Babby, Shrimp Mania, and Andy Noted. Also to my Twitch if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live. That said, I'll catch you in the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.